We have a very special podcast today. We chat with wise woman Naomi Jannson about all things postpartum. In a world that glorifies doing it all, having it all together, and getting back your pre-birth body as quickly as possible, Naomi reminds us that postpartum is a time of rest and nourishment, that honouring this time is what will set us up for motherhood and beyond. She delivers this wisdom with a mix of evidence-based scientific research and traditional therapeutic knowledge. With the postpartum conference coming up this September, we are so excited to chat with this amazing woman.
Eleanor, we have a very special guest here today.
I'm so excited.
It's one of my favourite people, Naomi. Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you here. We were so lucky to have you on one of the panels on the Gold Coast. And seriously, it was such an incredible event having you. I can't remember who else was there. You're like one of the highlights. And we're so lucky to have you joining us today. So welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's always fun getting together, the three of us, I feel. So any opportunity to get together, I'm so grateful.
Oh,
it's
so
nice.
So good. So for those that don't know Naomi, I first heard about you from your Instagram page. Your Instagram is so good. It's gentle_traditions, right?
Yeah.
I always feel so inspired watching your posts come through, like your reels and what you're up to in clinic. So I'll go through your bio so everyone knows who you are. And if you don't follow Naomi on Instagram, do it. You will not be disappointed. You will feel so inspired. So Naomi Jannson is a registered acupuncturist and nurse with 25 years of experience in healthcare, traditional medicine, a doctor with training in traditional Japanese, Chinese, Tibetan, and Ayurvedic medicine, integrating her experience as a registered nurse with intercultural folk women's medicine, practicing as a preconception, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, pregnancy loss, and stillbirth. In addition to this, Naomi is well established as an educator and mentor for practitioners of traditional medicine, orthodox medicine, postpartum, and women's health care practitioners. She also dedicates her energy as an advocate for traditional medicine and women-centered care. This is expressed through her formation of the Well-Supported Mother Collective in 2022, an interdisciplinary and mother-centered collective of practitioners dedicated to incredible outcomes for women during childbearing that honors women as the center. Human rights and biology, spiritual and cultural aspects of the childbearing journey, whilst optimizing health outcomes for mothers, babies, and families. Wow.
Holy moly.
Seriously.
You've been busy.
How does she do it? How old are you? It's like you've been doing it since you've been born.
Well, that's pretty much how it happened. Thanks, Amanda. So that is kind of the bio of someone, of a combination of things. So yes, I was born into a household which I see as a great privilege of my life. And I often talk about it, that, my dad was already studying and practicing as a Chinese medicine doctor when I was born, and my mum was practicing herbal medicine and, lots of naturopathic style medicine. So I really grew up immersed in that as my reality and my context for life. And my expectations, I suppose, got set very high about the resources one should have in life to navigate life. And so that's sort of where I launched from. And then as I got a bit older, I started feeling that I wanted to do like compassionate based work and travel. And so to do that, I decided to become a nurse and became a registered nurse, having really not set foot in a hospital, not really ever having been to see a doctor. I had no idea what a nurse did when I made that decision, and ended up becoming a nurse, working in acute care, in emergency and ICU and places like that over my nursing career. And then, but always had so I had that kind of immersive environment always around medicine and seeking to understand, what is health, what informs health. I did a lot of work around, working with other cultures and looking at the sociology of health and how our environment informs health and how policy informs health and politics and religion and culture. So I had been introduced to all of that along my journey in Korea, very young actually. And then after sort of fulfilling my goals in that area of medicine, I had a choice to make, and I was thinking, what do I want to do, as I extend my career, and had a couple of choices. I was thinking about becoming like a trauma retrieval specialist, a medical doctor, or a Chinese medical doctor. And I ended up choosing Chinese medicine. And yet, best decision I ever made in my life, I feel. And that launched me back into like a formal study of Chinese medicine. I did my master's in Chinese medicine. I had already been traveling to Japan previously and had my father's sensei teacher I met when I was 12 years old. And I had been attending those seminars as a child and exposed to that. And then that teacher became my teacher. And I started traveling annually to Japan to study with my teacher every year. And then I was very privileged again. My dad basically flew me all over the world to travel and receive teachings, and particularly Ikeda sensei, my teacher from Japan, would teach in various places around the world, and I would go to receive the teachings. So I've been traditionally apprenticed, as well as having, my medical qualifications and experience. So you can kind of pick up a theme that's kind of fairly consistent around the way that I've done things, as I tend to span both the yin and the yang, we would say, as Chinese medicine doctors. I explore those two expanses and then see what's sitting in between. And I was have been very dedicated to that path for my entire life. And then a lot changed for me when I was initiated into having my own children. And that then joined this whole spectrum of understanding that was already growing. And it really lit a fire in me, because I could see that certain outcomes were happening that really didn't need to be happening like that. And I was somewhat internally just enraged, because I felt like I could see in a really crystallized way the disservice to humanity to allow this to be happening. And so it's been such a fascinating journey. And then that I had already been studying other traditional medicine systems, but coming into women's medicine and understanding women's medicine, I took an even broader sort of inquiry into what's commonly called folk medicine or traditional women's medicine. And I went more intercultural, so outside of just the East Asian earth medicines, and went and started researching sort of global, South America, Europe, lots of different places. So yeah, it's sort of seems like a lot, and I suppose it is a lot, but at the same time, it's all really fundamentally kind of the same thing in a way. So yeah, it's been, I've had the time of my life doing it all. But it's really landed me exactly where I am in terms of my understanding and my complete dedication to communicating to the clients that I work with, to my community, and to my health colleagues, the importance of the continuum of care for women's health, and how much change we can actually make when we have the vision and the sort of the understanding of just the foundations, because currently what we have in a lot of modernized, westernized countries, that continuum is quite broken down. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're seeing some of the outcomes that we're seeing for women and women's health and families. And what I know to be true is that with support and a bit of knowledge, there are so many things that we can avoid. So that's where I'm coming from with a lot of my decisions of what projects I take on and what I do comes from that place.
Yeah, and particularly in that postpartum period as well, which is what, as you know, our next film is on. We really notice observing, women in all different situations, just the impact that having care or not having care and having community and not having community impacts on that woman and that baby and that community. It's just so important. It's like the forgotten lesson, the postpartum period. And what I find so interesting about your work is how you integrate different cultural wisdom into, practice in Australia. And I'm curious, for people that aren't familiar with your work, how do you integrate those philosophies into working to support a woman in that early postpartum period?
Yes, so to try and crystallize how I offer what I do, I have a fairly clear understanding of the physiology of the women's health continuum. And within that understanding, because of the years of experience that I have working with, my greatest teachers have been the women and the families that I've had the privilege to support. I've seen so many different versions of the journey of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, and how, a certain amount of that is dictated by the individual in terms of their decisions and how they're prioritizing things. A certain amount is to do with their environmental factors of like their family, who they've got available to them. Like even something as simple as a family that have two sets of parents living locally can completely change the trajectory of a whole family during the time of postpartum, for example. And then also if a culture values or doesn't value or communicates around postpartum and the value of mothers and how women are perceiving that and how much they're pushing themselves out of being a postpartum woman or allowed to or supported to rest in that and prioritize that. And then there's the greater environment in terms of like the journey of the pregnancy and the birth and the postpartum, like what actually happens at a physiological and potentially pathology that can come up, and how much, because where I think the disservice is somewhere along the line, we've decided to withhold the truth of what is pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, what it actually takes to achieve those things. Somehow we've ended up in a place where we withhold this from women and from the community generally in this modern context. And so women just suddenly find themselves drowning.
Yeah.
And it's like it's out of the blue. And it's like, we really don't need to be in that place. Like, how did we get there when this is something that such a high majority of people are going to experience? And yet we're in this very disjointed way. And I suppose a huge motivation for the work that I do was just the absolute disbelief of how many things we could avoid by understanding the foundations. And so a lot of my work is, rather than waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for a woman to put her hand up for help, which is for some reason physiologically wired for us not to ask for help. It's very difficult for a woman in postpartum to ask for help.
Yeah.
It is not her fault. It's biologically there for some reason. And I think it's just around the rite of passage that postpartum is. It's very difficult for postpartum women to identify what they need and ask for help. So there's such a complex moment, and everything is actually riding on that moment. And so it's incredible. So the more that you are clear about some foundations around what is needed, and the more that you attend to that, because that is what is needed, the less likely you will need to salvage a situation that has gone and resulted in quite significant health outcomes that could have been, in my opinion, often avoided. So because I've been doing this work for quite some time, I'm not shy around communicating the importance of this. So many women that I work with, I'm very clear about, if they're, they are wanting my input, I'm very clear about what I feel supports a postpartum. And I always have those education sessions with the husband or the partner and anyone who's going to be in their postpartum care team. And I explain all of that. And there's a really, there's so many reasons why that's important. One is and so I'm sort of going to just bear with me. I just want to talk about something really quick in terms of, I need to contextualize why I'm doing, because we have a little bit of I'm so glad that there's a resurgence of using traditional medicines and folk medicine in the postpartum space and for women's work, women's health. So I'm very, very passionate and excited, and feel hopeful about the resurgence of inquiry around those things, and especially the areas that we live, like the eastern coast of Australia. It's really become a lot more discussed, and that gives me a lot of hope in terms of women receiving the support and care. But there is a little bit of a thing there, because of our modern culture. We're grabbing at things that we don't actually know, and so it's kind of like a ticking off the list, kind of a little bit superficial level of understanding. So we don't understand the why we do certain things, but you're in postpartum, so we're going to do these things, which serves to a level, but there's like maybe an underappreciation of when to use those things, when not to use those things, and that the woman that you're working with and her family actually know why and what you're doing in those terms.
Just to interject there, for an example, for people who aren't kind of in that world, like the first thing that comes to mind is like belly wrapping,
Exactly. And for example, I'll just give you a few, because I could just talk about all of these things, so please give me so belly wrapping is somewhat pan-cultural. There's many cultures that have done different forms of belly wrapping. Some of the forms of belly wrapping are done at a different frequency to others and under different circumstances, and some were culturally put in place because mothers didn't have any help, and it's not actually ideal for a mother to necessarily be up on her feet with a belly wrap, especially if the belly wrap is applied in a poor way and she's using it to compensate so that she can be up and about, for example. And there's not that sort of understanding of, for how long that needs to be on for, how long it needs to be off for, that, if the superior kind of repair is often resting, you don't need to be necessarily bound if, have a binding or abdominal wrap if you're resting, for example. So there's just, and there's some people that there's, physical reasons why we might not use binding under certain circumstances. So we're in this amazing time of this, infusion of the modern and then the very traditional. And we need it all, in my opinion, to meet what is currently on our plate culturally to meet, because it's becoming evident to me that we can't just go back to the traditional framework in our modern lives, because most, a very high percentage of women don't have the village. And that model relied on a village type, or at least, a couple of sets of parents who would live in the home in order to achieve a traditional postpartum. So my work essentially predominantly is about trying to sort of provide what would be provided in a Chinese medicine framework of how women would be cared for in postpartum. So it's quite a big challenge, because there's a lot that goes into if you want to look at standards around postpartum care and the commitment to postpartum for the mother is the focus. And the commitment, often in that traditional sitting the moon, it's a 10 out of 10 commitment, but from the mother, from the family, because they're so attuned that family's well-being is running off the well-being of that mother.
Yeah.
And so there is a complete investment in the postpartum to the mother, knowing that she's the one that's going to be holding that whole family and future children. And so the commitment, and then also in Chinese medicine, we have an appreciation that how a mother does or doesn't receive care in postpartum is going to directly impact her at menopause. And women are very important in menopause and postmenopause culturally. So there's a high level of commitment. So a lot of my work has been in attempting to see how can we sort of provide that, but in that particular woman's circumstance, resource culturally appropriate, spiritually appropriate ways. And then after doing that kind of work for quite some time, and so a lot of my clients were my teachers as well. So some of how I've brought all of that skill set together was because of my own passion and drive, and seeking things out to become, to understand, and then seeing the common threads and understanding the underlying physiology of what was actually attempting to be achieved. And so that's a really interesting thing as you look at the different cultural approaches to postpartum. You see some really common themes around what's attempting to happen, and the timeframes that are put around how long that rest is happening for, the types of foods that are being offered, spiritual integration practices, and all of these kinds of things all coming together. So a lot of it are different ways of achieving a similar thing. And so I spent years working with that and finding the ways to make it appropriate to different people, either because of their cultural needs in terms of what food that they needed, and also then I would have different social circumstances that might come into it, or medical circumstances. So I suddenly would have this framework of knowing this is what is needed for a postpartum woman, to optimize her recovery and sort of protect her health and well-being. And then sometimes really big things would happen. And we would have to suddenly, so for example, I've worked with a lot of women whose babies have come between 30 weeks and 34 weeks. So suddenly the plan of staying at home for 4 weeks is not happening immediately from the moment that the baby's been born. And so now I've worked with quite a number of families that have had different really major events happen through the pregnancy or immediately after the birth. And I now have appreciation of how can we pivot in a moment like that, and also anticipating. And I've pulled towards me a team that also have expertise that can help get on board, where we sort of have an understanding of some framework of what will protect that woman and her situation from very significant health outcomes. So it's from a place of these clients, I would often be working with them through multiple pregnancies, and sometimes there would be a pregnancy loss or a birth that resulted in sort of a physical trauma of some kind to the body or in the emotional body. And so we can see patterns in how these things affect us and affect women, and we do have resources and structures, especially if we look at traditional societies, that help support and buffer. So I'm really passionate about these traditional ways of supporting, but then also being aware of protecting that clinical aspect of, it takes physical resources to be pregnant and birth and postpartum. So it's such a beautiful interweaving, and I suppose it's like an accurate reflection of where we are in modern life, essentially. Totally. Just all put together.
Yeah, it's really so special what you do, because I mean, there's a number of reasons. Firstly, I love what you said about how postpartum women often aren't even able to articulate what's going wrong. They just don't feel good. Their health is suffering, but they're so overwhelmed that they couldn't even, pinpoint or articulate or create a plan for moving forward to get themselves out of this overwhelm. And then also, what if the partner or the family members have been brought up differently, where they think of the women, should just pull up their bootstraps and get on with it. I had 7 kids, or whatever the story is. And so to have an authority figure come from the outside and be able to have both knowledge of, the medical system and then all those beautiful other cultural practices you've studied, it really, I can just imagine that being so beautifully supportive for the woman and having that plan in place, and then knowing if something goes wrong, like a premi, then, okay, we can pivot and I'm still supported.
Yeah.
How special.
I feel like it mimics a traditional way that we would look after women in, like, in some places you would call it a midwife, and the midwife would be working across that trajectory. Some places the midwife was just the birth, but in the traditional medicines, you would be responsible for that journey and the family ongoingly. And I feel like that is a big part of what makes it different for me in the way that I can offer care and the type of set, because what we're seeing, it's sort of funny, it's the most basic thing ever and it's almost laughable, but like it's now becoming sort of researched and clinically known. Like, women in postpartum need safety.
Yes.
They need a felt sense of safety, as the same as birth. We also need this in postpartum. It's really important. And so having a known person who can meet you with, because postpartum is wild. Postpartum is a complete reinvention, but it's in slow-mo. In birth, it's happening, and you're like in the birth hormone world. So it's almost in the subconscious realms. The postpartum is the integration of that the integration version of that part of the journey, and it's happening over days, weeks, months. It's a marathon. It's an absolute marathon to every aspect of who you are. And so it's to have at least a felt sense of safety, that you're not going to fall. Someone's got a container around you that you're not invisible in. Because if you talk to postpartum women, that's often some of the words that they'll use is things like, I was behind a glass wall, I was drowning and no one could see that I was drowning. And these are not just emotional experiences, they're physically often so under-resourced that actually that is what is going on, and in a physical way. So thank you, Eleanor. I really appreciate that. And I'd love to share just a really brief story that I think highlights what you were just saying, with a client that I worked with who did have that experience where she had a medical complication come up in her pregnancy, her first baby, medically uncomplicated, home birth, full term, sort of really positive birth experience, was studying, being a doula, very passionate, and then found out that she had a medical complication that 100% required a C-section. Both her and the baby's life would be at danger with any other version of birth. So she then had to fly. She lived in a rural, remote area. She had to fly away from her family and stay in the hospital full time. And she had to do her postpartum in her grandmother's house. So I started working with her in the pregnancy, and we would go in and we were doing rite of passage birth preparation work in the hospital, and doing acupuncture and, you know, supportive care and planning, and reinventing her version of what she could have for herself, and navigating really complex medical decisions about the birth and the immediate postpartum and hospital policy, everything like that. And then when she went home, I hadn't actually been to the home. Normally with women that I work with, are often a part of the family and a part of that planning and a part of the home, but I hadn't in this particular case because she'd been in the hospital. And then I went into her home and she was living with her grandmother, and exactly what you just said, Eleanor, she was, and because she'd been quite good after the first baby, which was a vaginal birth, everyone around her had an expectation that she was going to be up and out of the bed pretty much immediately. And this time she'd had a C-section. There was a lot more going on for her. And then we were going and cooking for her and doing treatments and supportive care. And then I would speak with her, and she was getting initially questioned, particularly by her grandmother. Why are you getting all this help? Surely you don't need it. I did it, you know, and things like that, like quite directly. And then over the time, we just kept going back, kept doing the cooking, kept just created this little bubble around this woman, but included the family. And I did like education sessions and everything. And then what started to happen over time, because the grandmother, had been quite, I think, inside very upset that she'd had to work so hard, but it came out in that moment towards her granddaughter in that way. And so, but over the weeks, she started to eat the postpartum food as well. The grandmother did, and she was taking these Ayurvedic teas that we were making up, and these beautiful congee Chinese traditional dishes, and actually she was like ordering extra food. By the time we finished the postpartum, she was ordering the foods off us. She really enjoyed it. So and she also understood the principles around postpartum. And so I knew that with that particular lady, should she have another baby, that her family already would have a lot more tools and equipment to support. So yeah, it's just a really interesting time that we're sort of reintroducing what would probably, you know, we're idealizing a little bit, but let's say in the past we're assuming that there would have been a lot more generalized support.
And just that healing for that grandmother as well. You can almost feel her releasing that like anger and that like resentment that I had to do it myself. I didn't get any of this. So, you know, this is how you prove that, you know, you soldier on. And then just letting that guard down and going, oh, like, no, okay.
Feels so nice.
Feels so nice. Yeah.
It's so nurturing.
I'm going to lean into
it. This is
what it should have been like. And now I can gift this to, you know, my grandchild. That sounds so good. I wonder if you do like postpartum, like my youngest is 2. Can you still help me find a balance?
Yeah, so this is the whole thing, is that we're only ever on a continuum. So the most intensive time of recovery and repair, where the body is very open to suggestibility of repairing, is that first 6 weeks after having a baby. So we often hear about it, the golden window, golden opportunity, first 40 days, framing like that. However, we can re-postpartum if needed, but wherever we land, and Dr. Oscar Serelak's got some really interesting research around this as well, saying that sometimes the peak of postpartum depletion is when the child is 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
So
Wow.
accumulate the depletion for multiple reasons if we don't actually stop to recover. So I'll just use an example that I love to share when I'm doing sort of that kind of education, is that essentially for anyone who's ever run a garden, especially along the principles of sort of permaculture, if you want a tree within a garden to thrive, there's quite a few core components that we know are required, because if you want to ask a tree to produce fruit, we know that it's actually consuming its resources. So we need to make sure that the soil's good quality. We need to give the tree a rest. It doesn't fruit 12 months of the year. We have to fertilize the soil. We need to make sure there's enough sunlight, that the soil is drained enough and doesn't get, overlogged with water, and that, we're mineralizing that soil and we're watering enough. And essentially, like, we are a more complex version of that, because we have the social, emotional body as well. But even just on the pure physiological perspective, that resource, it sort of slowly accumulates, but some of it doesn't come back. And in some ways, what got me started on this trajectory is that my grandmother, who had 5 children and was very impoverished during pregnancies and postpartums, all of her teeth fell out when she was 40.
Wow.
Wow.
And it's actually very common for women to lose teeth in postpartum still now.
Wow.
And that is a combination of reasons why that happens. But in my grandmother's case, it was predominantly just malnourishment. So the whole idea, or my whole perspective, is, ideally that first 6 weeks, but if we don't get that window for some reason, we just keep going until we've done the work to replenish. So that's how I see it. It's a continuum. There's something that's going out from the mother to the baby, and then to like sustain the baby beyond the birth. And most people don't realize it actually takes more, even just on a calorie level, to breastfeed a baby than it is to be pregnant.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah. So we actually need to increase a lot of the support and the care in postpartum, not decrease. The needs are actually going up. So you're kind of getting the picture. Like, there's some pretty core fundamental requirements that we're really missing the mark, but we can come to support that at any point in time. But the ideal is before we get to perimenopause or menopause.
Got it. Is there, like, obviously each of your client is an individual and you'll treat them each as an individual with their individual circumstances, but is there some general themes that you're going to hit almost every time you're there, i.e., the first 6 weeks, you hammer that in, the first 6 weeks is really important. Are there several other things where you're going to talk about that with the partner and the support team?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, and this is what we're talking about, that we've got foundational care and then we've got clinical care. So foundational care will often compensate and reduce the need or the severity of clinical care that might be required. So everyone who has a baby requires foundational care. Foundational care is the principle that I just spoke about, understanding that the woman's body is actually providing and we need to put back in. And the key 5 ways, the foundational ways that seem to be common around the world with cultural practices that support women in postpartum are rest, significant rest. I'm talking weeks in the home and potentially in bed. Warmth, keeping her warm, the environment warm. Nourishment is absolutely key. And then we, like those of us who do the type of work that I do, when we talk about nourishment, we're really talking about quite a high level of understanding of the nutrients and minerals required for pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding and postpartum recovery, because there is really quite direct outcomes from not having certain nutrients. So there are nutrients that are required to help stabilize the thyroid. Women who are in postpartum have a much higher chance for the first year after having a baby of having an acute thyroid condition. And so we can ensure that we're providing those nutrients in the food or via other means to protect her against that. The next one is ritual. So this is sort of attending to the spiritual integration that every woman has to do after every birth and every baby. They require honoring of that and ritual. And then it's like a recognition or social support, community support. And so we need to, and that also leads into that sense of safety as well. So sometimes that sense of safety is just knowing that people know that you are there at home on your own with a new baby, and just knowing that people know that can sometimes increase the sense of safety.
You're not going to get safety from our culture. Yeah.
No, it's not there. And it's really interesting how we've landed in a place that's almost what you would call a counterculture to what women in motherhood need.
Yeah,
where we've landed, and it's honestly beyond my mind that we could get so far away from what is foundational. So, and it's, as I said, it's like quite often described as a shock. Women are quite shocked about what happens, especially, if you, I could keep talking on and on, but so we do have that foundational support. So for example, with women who are resourced for it, but if they're not resourced, I work with their family and the people around them to try and resource them to understand what their partner or wife or daughter needs or sister will need in the postpartum. So a huge amount of my work is this education work, which is why I created the Well Supported Mother Collective, because we needed to be able to provide, really beautiful education and support to families to give them the resources. Some people are resourced enough. And as I was saying, I've worked with women where I've seen them almost pretty much every week from 3 months leading into the pregnancy, the whole pregnancy. And then I have a unique practice. Most Chinese medicine doctors don't do this, but women who I support in that way, I actually go and do 6 weeks of in-home care for them, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And then if their birth has unexpectedly landed with baby, in intensive care, I've driven to other, to the major hospitals, over an hour away to do treatments in the hospital to help the mother integrate and achieve all of these foundational. So I keep that consistent no matter the circumstances. We just stick to it, how we can do that. So it's 6 weeks. And as I said, like, I've worked with women with, where it's been from pregnancy to pregnancy, and postpartum to postpartum. So but not everyone's privileged enough, but at least to give that resource to the community that around them, and take the onus off the mother to try and do that and give that resource, but the context of that to everyone involved around her. And I've found that to be actually very, like, one of my clients just had an incredible birth over in Europe, and we were able to achieve all of these things via doing online consultations and phone calls within 12 hours of the baby being born, and working out the complexities of her postpartum, and the way that the birth unfolded, and putting things in place. So the pre-planning can really, and just that clear sort of insight into what those foundations are, it just takes so much of what can often feel overwhelming, uncontrollable, unpredictable. It's actually not that many things once you have the structure that you understand. And again, this is where I started to work collectively, because I've been doing this work for quite some time, and I started to realize, like, I actually can't sustain this. I can't be a whole village for everybody, because it started to invert the other way, where I was kind of trying to compensate for all of these things. And I was like, I actually need, we need more support, more resources. So I started working collaboratively and collectively, both with doulas who do postpartum work, and then also other clinical specialists who provide postpartum care, to be able to see how fully we could support women as they go through the postpartum.
Oh, amazing. You made the village.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Banksy, we are interviewing Naomi for the next film, right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
We're going to need a few days.
Yeah,
There's so much knowledge. Oh my gosh.
It's so much. I know. And I really want to do some filming of women receiving the care as well, because
Definitely.
it's hard for us to understand what that actually looks like, because
Yep.
we've never received it. And it's so beautiful, to receive that level of nourishment. Every woman deserves to feel that supported. Imagine how different our community and society would be if women were treated this way, and how that impact would ripple out, from that individual to the children, to the relationship, to their cousins. And then, that the whole world would change. It's almost more important than birth. Birth is hugely important, but postpartum, it's that integration. And if you don't get that nourishment, it just feels like it's hugely impactful.
It is massively, and in a huge number of births, if physiological birth happens, there's actually not that much necessarily direct impact. Sometimes things will happen, sure, but the birth, the mechanisms are all in place, those beautiful hormones. Postpartum's really different to that. Postpartum's it's the marathon, it's a demand, it's a massive demand, and it's going to be there day after day after day, and yet we don't prepare for it. The thing is, we kind of know what it takes to do that, but yet it's just not ingrained in part of our culture. But when you do see, I think that's what's really helped me with that, as I was saying, I have this very high expectation, because in Chinese medicine, the expectation is that women should exit postpartum in better health than before they were pregnant. That's actually the expectation. And so what we're doing is working through whatever her unique circumstances are, plus the foundation. But I'm always interested in how that can look different for person to person, journey to journey. So, being able to have that flexibility within all of that. And there's great books and resources and people doing incredible work. So my work as well then sort of leads into what, my health advocacy work, and which also is about collaboration of people who are mother-centered in terms of because what can happen as well with postpartum is that if a woman has a problem with their pelvic floor, they go and see this person, and then they might have, you know, what's seen as a psychological, you know, depression, and then they go and see that person, you know, a counselor or a psychologist, and all these different, but no one's talking to each other, and no one's kind of overseeing what's happening. And sometimes as well, women aren't being seen in what's really going on, and then they're a little bit misdirected in terms of the support, because there's no one who really understands postpartum involved in helping her to understand where she is and be able to navigate through that.
It's fractured.
And all of healthcare is because of like modernization of specialization. But women's health, I feel, doesn't have to be that way. And that's also because it's such a mismatch to what postpartum needs. It is the literal opposite of what postpartum needs. So, so I've been sort of very active in recruiting people, as you say, Eleanor, to like a village type style approach of getting as many people as possible on the same page. And that's everybody. It's not just health specialists, or not just the family, or not just the one doula care provider. It's sort of everybody, as much as possible being on that same page. And I've seen kind of incredible journeys of what's been able to be achieved.
And that kind of leads me on to, if you'd like to share with us the postpartum conference that you have organised, because, you know, really that's about getting everyone on the same page and providing that education on how important postpartum is. There's so many birth conferences, but I have never seen a postpartum conference. And it just reflects how little importance is placed on postpartum in Western society. And I love that you have organised this conference. And would you like to share with everyone just a little bit about what to expect? What is it? When's it happening? And yeah, who's going to be there? We're going to be there. Yeah. We're excited. But who else?
So the postpartum conference has been a journey for me for the last couple of years. And basically, from that place of just astonishment of like, why aren't, so for example, even in Chinese medicine school, which foundationally and culturally, that medicine really honors women's health, is very high in prioritization of Chinese medicine. But when I did my modern degree, we basically, I think we covered 1 or 2 points about lactation and breast milk, kind of thing. It was like a few disjointed things in one lecture, and then nothing, essentially. So even in natural or holistic health, there's an absence of attention to that part of the continuum. And that's mirrored a lot in even midwifery training and medical training. They don't necessarily actually understand the physiology of postpartum. And also what Dr. Oscar Serelak talks about is that there's actually been a real lack of research or attention on the physiology of postpartum. So almost all of the research that we're dealing with is really like current or new, because there was no inquiry into that from a medical scientific perspective. So we're doing a lot of catch up there. So essentially, I created this conference because of just my absolute disbelief of the lack of attention, but also through doing that more cultural type of learning and going to China and being in Japan and places where that traditional approach, and like South America still has a really strong tradition of women's care continuum. And you see the way that they attend and how much benefit that the mothers are getting out of that routine care, and also understanding the physiology. I became really passionate about creating a cultural shift. I didn't know what else to do, to be honest. So I was like, I don't really know what else is going to shift this. And me as an individual, I can't do that on my own. So it's only as a cultural shift and as a collective that we can possibly attempt to address this. So that is where the vision for the Well Supported Mother Collective came together. And I also chose speakers, and I'll share with you briefly, you know, the structure of the conference and the speakers, and then a few additional things that have been created as a consequence. What I did was I chose key speakers on areas that I felt were foundational and fundamental to every woman's postpartum requirements, so that we could at least get through and invite, you know, health practitioners that are working with women in pregnancy that don't know anything about postpartum. They're not preparing their clients. They're not educated. It's not their fault. It's just lacking in the culture, lacking in the education. So this is an attempt to bridge that gap by looking at the foundations, and we're also going to be covering complex clinical care as well, where, you know, like for example, I've worked with women who, you know, we've needed to do postpartum care because they've had a stillbirth, for example, and that postpartum looks really different to a normal postpartum. So there's a skill set and a physiology. The physiology of recovering from a stillbirth is different to the physiology of recovering from a full-term birth of a living baby. So, and not, you know, you can imagine there's lots of gaps around that kind of knowledge. So we're looking at complex cases as well as the foundations. We've got our keynote speaker is Dr. Oscar Serelak, who will be doing the neurobiology of postpartum and talking about essentially like the hormones and the neurotransmitters, and how that just how we're feeling is actually a sign of the physiology that's happening in the body. It's not a projection of what that individual is choosing to feel.
Mm.
So, and then we've got Dr. Moira Bradfield, who's a PhD naturopath by published research in the female microbiome of the vagina. And she is covering basically the breastfeeding and lactation causing vaginal atrophy in women. It can cause massive complications in terms of vaginal health and well-being, and that she's doing a unique presentation because that's quite new research. So this is the first time that she's
going to be so good.
I know, I'm so excited. I'm just trying to hold it back.
Oh my God, even just with like those three.
I'm like, and myself, I will be covering, you know, how do we adapt to complex situations and unexpected situations in postpartum, and why would we do that, which is, I've touched on that today, but I'm going into that in depth and case studies. We've got a nutritionist, Talia, who wrote Nourishing Those Who Nurture, which is a published book on postpartum care. Renee Dyson-Holland is a naturopath who is specialised in mother care, and she will be talking about the naturopathic approaches to the continuum of women's healthcare. And we've got beautiful Jenny Blythe, who is an incredible resource in the birth and postpartum world and has been offering her services, working alongside women through similar in the way that she works through the whole trajectory of the pregnancy, the birth and the postpartum. She has a particular interest in the pelvic dynamics and pelvic care and pelvic restoration, and she will be talking on that topic, but specific to postpartum. Oh, I'm getting nervous now that I'm going to forget someone. Nicola Phoenix is a psychologist who will be sharing with us. She's a perinatal psychologist, and she'll be sharing with us on her specialty. We have Dr. Danielle Arabina, who is Indigenous Torres Strait Islander, a medical practitioner, a doula, a shamanic practitioner, and she's actually will be speaking about breastfeeding and the importance of breastfeeding, particularly from the Indigenous perspective, and what we have got to learn from the Indigenous perspective on breastfeeding. And we've got as well Mona Board, who is a biological dentist, and she's going to be talking about the importance of oral health for mothers, and also the journey of like the oral structure of babies, which is really important for us to understand, because we're actually having a much higher prevalence because of this lack of nutrition that we're seeing. It's impacting the way that babies, you know, formation of bones and things like that. So pretty sure I've managed to cover everyone, but there's nine of us speaking at this conference.
Amazing.
We're doing discussions as well, interactive discussions, so that it's not just a one-way present your topic and walk out the door. There's opportunity for questions and integration. And then, as that was what the conference was, I was like, okay, phew, I've done that, I'm going to get through that. And then this idea came about of we should have an expo where people can talk about services that are for postpartum women. And then that has ended up bringing in a whole layer of attracting people, service providers and innovators in this field who have this common knowledge of really, really good help and support for women at this particular point of time, how much impact that has on the health journey. And so we have some incredible not-for-profits coming in to share with us, and documentary makers like yourself, and broadcasters and authors, and some products that are specifically for women's health and postpartum. But it's very much like all of the people that it's ended up attracting have got that same ethos of just so passionate about women's health and outcomes for women. And so there's like a real tangible feeling of starting to like, that conference isn't for another 5 weeks. It's in September. It's on the first weekend of September, the 7th and 8th of September in Coolangatta. But the kind of energy that's building around it and the conversation that's building around it is just so exciting. It's what I had hoped for at sort of, that's my end goal vision. I wasn't expecting it to kind of start to feel like, oh my gosh, that actually feels like it's really got some momentum around it. And that's why it's so important that you're doing what you're doing in terms of creating a documented and filmed commentary around the importance of postpartum.
Yeah,
it's
so
really
important.
It's really, because what movie ever shows postpartum? Like, birth is already like off the scale in terms of what it you know, with that external representation, which is often how we make our mental frameworks, is it's about what we see. And because we're not in women's homes doing, you know, looking after women and making soups for our aunties and things like that, like we're not generally doing those things anymore. And then we don't see it in the media. So it's just all a big mystery and a big surprise. And so, you know, that visual part in terms of documenting is so essential to the future of women's health and postpartum.
I can't wait to see it when it comes together. And I think we might finish on that note. On behalf of myself and Eleanor and Amy, like, honestly, thank you so much for all of the work that you do in the community with individuals and practitioners, and on the online space and all over the world, and for this conference as well. We are, you know, we're all so grateful for you, for all your work, sharing all your wisdom.
Definitely.
You're the best. You're the best.
The feeling is mutual.
Aww.